Order. Welcome to the first evidence session of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee's pre-legislative scrutiny of the Government Draft Media Bill. We're joined today by the Commercial Public Service Broadcasters. We have Magnus Brooke, the Group Director of Strategy, Policy and Regulation from ITV, Khalid Hayat, the Director of Strategy from Channel 4, and Mitchell Simmons, the Vice President for Public Policy and Government Affairs at Paramount, which includes Channel 5. Before we begin, it might be very helpful for the panel and those watching our proceedings to be clear that today's session is not about the widely reported issues at This Morning and ITV and the broader implications for public service broadcasting. We will be hearing next week from Dame Carolyn McCall, ITV's CEO, specifically to discuss those matters, and we'll be raising them, of course, with other broadcasters in due course as well. Today, we very much want to focus on the draft media bill and the significant implications that has for the industry. Before we begin questioning, can I just ask members if they have any interests to declare, please? Simon.
I'm a former employee of ITV.
John?
Yes, I'm a former news presenter at ITV.
Damien?
I used to work for ITN, so of course part of ITV, specifically on Channel 4 News, so I cover both of those, and I've accepted hospitality from Channel 4 in the past 2 years.
Gareth?
I have worked for ITV.
Anyone else? No. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to kick off the questions, and I want to start by talking about the public service remit. We know that the current legislation has a requirement to provide specific coverage on various genres, including things like education and drama and comedy and children's and religion. But those specifications are removed by this new piece of legislation. What will be the consequences of removing these specific genres from the public service broadcasting remit, Magnus?
I'm not sure there necessarily will be very significant implications from that, partly because what that does is look at the system as a whole. It doesn't look at any individual broadcaster and say you have to provide each of those genres as part of your contribution to PSB. So in ITV's case, a core part of our contribution is news, whether that's nations, regional, national news, also current affairs, production outside London, independent production. So we make a very significant contribution to PSB in those areas, but no individual PSB, with the possible exception of the BBC, can cover every single area of the PSB waterfront. And I think what that looks at is the system taken as a whole. Is it providing appropriate coverage of all of those genres? So I don't think, in our case at least, it's going to make an enormous difference to how we deliver PSB, because I think we're very clear what our unique contribution is as part of an overall system. And of course, the Secretary of State is proposing to take a power to impose new quota obligations, should that be necessary, should there be a concern from Ofcom in particular that there's a particular genre of programming where there's a shortfall of delivery.
Khalid, what's Channel 4's thoughts on this?
Similar position. So we very much support the approach to a more outcomes-based approach to regulation of PSB, and therefore support the approach to the PSB remit that's been defined in the draft media bill. At the same time, we as Channel 4 will also retain our own specific and distinctive PSB remit to challenge, to provide innovative content, and therefore we'll continue to fulfil that remit, and we measure ourselves on delivery of that remit through the Statement of Media Content Policy, which we publish and Ofcom reviews and holds us to account to. But at the same time, of course, there will continue to be obligations in the licence for Channel 4 and for other broadcasters on news, current affairs, regional productions, independent productions, which all fit with the key areas of content that the government has specified in the draft media bill, and again will make positive contributions to PSB in the round.
Mitchell, what kind of reassurances can you give us that taken together public service broadcasters will continue to be able to provide a diversity in the range of programmes in such things as arts and religion?
I think the key point to make, to build on the two previous answers, there's the PSB ecology is built around a certain level of complementarity between the different broadcasters. So we have increased obligations on children's content. We also have the milkshake programme each morning. We have responsibilities on current affairs, regional programming, news, that is different from the obligations on other public service broadcasters. And the idea is that taken as a whole, the obligations on each of the broadcasters create some diversity and complementarity between the broadcasters. I think we all, we never called for a simplification of the remit. I think we're very happy with the simplification of the remit, and we don't foresee from ourselves as Channel 5 any change in the output that we'll put on our schedule as a result of these changes.
Do you think that there would be a decline in the way that these different aspects are covered in the linear services and a temptation to put everything onto the on-demand?
Well, I think that's going to be an important safeguard for Ofcom when it's looking at this issue. Clearly, a key element of the draft media bill is about recognising that as audiences are moving away from live TV and linear TV viewing and are starting to view online, that PSBs will be able to meet some of their obligations through their online services. But equally, it's important that viewers who are still watching on linear, primarily on their linear channels, are also able to access that PSB content. So I think as we manage that move away from linear towards VOD, and it's going to happen over a period of time, we need to make sure that the bill is pretty good, we feel, in the round, ensures that Ofcom has the duties to ensure, just as Khaled has remarked, that if there is a gap, if there is an issue, in conjunction with the Secretary of State, they're able to make an intervention to correct things if they think they're not happy.
Khaled, we're concerned that those who aren't digitally enabled, those who don't have access to the internet for a whole range of reasons, won't be excluded from the range of different types of programming. What reassurances can you give us that there won't be any sort of decline in the public service provision on your main linear channel?
Yeah, so we're committed to our main linear channel, the core Channel 4 service, which is the designated public service broadcaster, but we deliver our remit across all our services, of course. But we're committed to the core linear service, and whilst at the same time transforming our business in order to drive digital growth, to anticipate and reshape what we're doing, in response to the market change and changing of viewing behaviour that Mitchell has described. But I think it's worth just being clear that we as Channel 4, and indeed all the broadcasters, have very much supported the extension of the licences for the digital terrestrial multiplexes. So we're all committed to and want a linear terrestrial digital broadcasting to continue well into the 2030s. So that's absolutely core to what we're doing. We're talking to Ofcom right now about the renewal of our broadcasting licence, which expires at the end of 2024. And again, that will continue to include obligations on the linear channel. But at the same time, for Channel 4, given that we do have a skew younger than other public service broadcasters, we are, of course, anticipating what a younger audience is doing, where are they watching content, how can we deliver our remit across streaming platforms more effectively and drive growth in that area, and similarly expanding onto social platforms through Full Studio.
And Magnus, but what about for ITV? We know that you've had an enormous amount of investment in your online services and viewing on-demand services in the last couple of years, and at the same time cuts to some other aspects such as children's TV. How will we protect the linear services at ITV?
I think I can reassure you on that, in the sense that what I think we're moving to is a hybrid world of linear and on-demand, with streaming effectively a sort of hybrid of hybrids. In a way, it's a delivery of a linear broadcast service, but not linear service through IP. But for us, we've never really made niche content, niche PSB content. We've made content for which we want trying to find a mass audience. So we're trying to find that spot where we can get a big audience for PSB content. That's our rationale as a PSB. And the truth is that we're going to have to serve the linear audience and the on-demand audiences equally over time, because half the audience, or more than half the audience, is currently linear, and there's a significant audience in on-demand. If we're going to be able to pay for the content, we're going to have to use it both on linear and on-demand for some time to come. At the moment, I think there are about 3.8 million households that are IP only, so they don't have a broadcast feed coming in. There are some estimates that suggest that might be up to 50% by 2030. and we anticipate that maybe 50-50 viewing in the UK television market as a whole. Around 50% of viewing will be on demand, 50% linear by about the mid 2030s. So for us to be able to afford to pay for the content, we're going to have to, as it were, advertise to an audience, if you like, on linear, because there's a very significant audience there, but there's a very significant growing audience in on demand. So for us, the idea that we just put content in one place or the other doesn't make any commercial sense.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. If we could talk about the shift from proportion-based quotas to absolute ones to start with, if that's all right. How will that change the way you fulfil your public service remit? Mitchell, I'll come to you first, if that's all right.
Thank you. I mean, I think so the first point, just to pick up Magnus' earlier comment, Channel 5 still has quite a significant linear audience. Channel 5 is a destination for factual television, for leading on social issues, for the early broadcast of news at 5 p.m. So it tends to skew outside of the metropolitan centres, outside of London, and as a consequence, we have quite a strong linear viewing. In terms of remit delivery, we therefore don't feel, we don't foresee a significant change. We feel that what we provide brings audiences to our schedule. It's absolutely critical that we do a full day of programming and people arrive, and we provide some complementarity to the rest of the market. But at the same time, My5 is growing, and we're also ensuring that audiences, as they gradually move there, we're providing for all of them. So we don't foresee any significant change to our output.
Based on that, Khalid, your audience is very different to Channel 4 because you're more metropolitan. Do you perceive a difference in approach there?
In terms of application of the quotas.
Yeah.
So on the topic in the area of absolute quotas, we absolutely support the principle that the government has set out that public service delivery should count across a range of platforms, right? And as we're all saying, we're about balancing output on linear and streaming services. And we also support the principle and welcome the principle that any new absolute quotas will be no more onerous than existing quotas. But as you'll have seen from our written evidence, we have expressed some concern about the concept of absolute quotas. And the reason for that is because of the reduction in flexibility that those absolute quotas would provide. So indeed we think the effects of those are twofold. So one being that by having absolute quotas, that reduces the incentive on broadcasters to over-deliver on quotas when times are good, because there's an absolute number that you're trying to hit, and partly reduces the incentive to over-deliver in order to save up, as it were, in order to because there's reduced flexibility to adjust commissioning activity when times are tougher. So we do have some concerns about the lack of flexibility that those absolute quotas would provide, and so it's an area that we have been discussing with Ofcom and DCMS in order to address this.
You feel you've been heard in those discussions?
I think the government's position on that is they do want to implement the absolute quota. So I think we understand that Ofcom do share some of the concerns about the lack of flexibility. But what we don't have at this point is a ready-made solution to how to address those risks. But it's an area that we are alive to.
How much a risk is it to your business?
Well, all commercial businesses, we obviously are facing into the ad market. We make commissioning decisions in order to fulfil our remit, and in the light of the commercial circumstances that we're facing, and therefore reducing the flexibility that we have available to us does reduce some of the levers that we have to pull, and particularly in relation to, for example, regional production quotas, for instance. Where we're working with a supply base distributed across the country, absolute quotas create a degree of compliance risk in the event that if certain programs are pushed out later and so on and so forth, there becomes a compliance risk in relation to fulfilment of those quotas.
Understood. Magnus, same question to you.
Well, look, we've a slightly different position, I think, to Channel 4, which is I think we broadly support volume-based quotas, with one small exception. And the reason for that, I think, is that for us, I mean, as we've talked about, there are 3.8 million households in the UK at the moment who don't have a broadcast service. So for them, ITVX is effectively ITV's PSB contribution, and that number is only going to increase over time, potentially as much as 50% or so in the next 10 years. So for us, it's important that we can deliver our quotas online as well as on linear. And we think volume quotas delivered online are quite important. And the reason for that is a simple one, which is the denominator of a percentage-based quota on an online service is really, it's a floating denominator effectively, because we've got 15,000 hours on ITVX, for example, at the moment. That number fluctuates rapidly over time, over the course of a year. It's not like a 24/7 linear service where you have, in effect, a fixed number of hours, more or less, and therefore you can have a percentage quota relatively straightforwardly. On a service where you've got a very big fluctuation potential, or a significant fluctuation over time, and it's never constant. It's never exactly the same amount of hours. So you wouldn't actually know what the percentage number was until you got to the end of the year, effectively, if you're basing a percentage quota around ITVX, which is why we would support a volume-based quota. As Khalid said, no more and no less onerous than, let's say, the average of what the quota would have been over the last 5 years or so, which I think is the government's proposal. The area where I don't think we agree is in relation to or at least we have concerns, is in relation to the out-of-London spend quota, because there the government's proposal is to actually write a number down about this is the minimum amount of money you have to spend outside London. And to Khalid's point about fluctuations in the advertising market, if you take the COVID year, for example, would you be able to guarantee that you could meet an absolute number of spend? Because in the end, our budgets have to fluctuate over time to reflect fluctuations in the advertising market, because we're commercially funded. We do have a concern that writing in a number without any caveat around, look, there has to be some reflection of economic circumstance, or if you're outside a certain set of tram lines, then there may be some flexibility around that number. That's our concern.
Focusing on ITVX for a second, I know that you perceive that there's a problem with keeping programmes online for 30 days. Could you explain and contextualise to us this morning why that's such a problem for you?
Yeah, no, very happy to. And the reason it matters is because it links into the prominence obligation, or the prominence benefit, if you like, from the PSB point of view, but also, as we may come on to talk about, the agreement objectives for the settlement of disputes between PSBs and platforms. So that's why it matters, because effectively content has to be up for 30 days on ITVX in order to count towards those two things. And look, from our point of view, we want to keep content as long as possible, because by definition, that maximises the number of people who see it, and therefore maximises the amount of money we can make from advertising. So that is our baseline position. We want as much content for as many people as possible, as long as possible. So that's where we start. There are, in truth, rights reasons in a handful of areas, particularly news and particularly daytime. And the specific issue there is we rely on the fair dealing exception in relation to the use of music and images and so on. And our own legal view is it's difficult for us to keep that content up longer than 7 days if we're relying on those exceptions to maintain those programmes. So it's specifically about news and daytime. As it happens, actually not that many people want to access news and daytime programmes after 7 days. In fact, a vanishingly small number of people do. And we also think that it's important that particularly news programmes have an ability to get prominence on platforms. So it's for that reason. There is also a sport. There is also, just in the case of some sports rights, we simply don't have the right to keep it up for as long as 30 days. We'd love to keep it up for as long as possible.
Understood. And Khalid and Mitchell, do either of you have the same issue or similar concerns as ITV in relation to keeping content on for 30 days online on your respective on-demand services? Mitchell?
I think we sort of sympathetic to the ITV position. I think the main issue for us has historically been around the sports rights issue, that sometimes you simply cannot get the rights. Obviously, we like to keep content on there as long as possible, but in certain instances it's simply not possible. So.
Understood. Khalid?
Yeah, and again, sympathise and understand the position, and from our perspective, we want the wide array, the full array of Channel 4 content that we carry on our linear and streaming services to be subject to PSB prominence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert.
Yes, sports rights was just mentioned. I wanted to turn to listed events. So I suppose that's one where your usual binging, streaming on a box set versus linear real-time doesn't work. Well, people do watch it linear real-time. And in particular, these listed events where they go to traditionally broadcasters where 95% reach is there and it's offered for free. There are worries that this draft bill doesn't protect that listed events regime enough. With things like the FA Cup, the Wimbledon, those kind of things. So I just wondered, do you foresee any problems in the fact that this bill doesn't include digital rights at all?
Shall I answer that? Yes, we do. Listed events are very important for the delivery of PSB. They're one of the really best examples of the way in which PSB can bring the whole nation together. So young and old, people from all over the country come together. We had, I think, a peak audience of 27 million people watching the Euros in 2021.
The demand on the national grid when everyone's putting their kettle on at the same time.
Quite. But interestingly, within that, about 7.5% or so of our viewing for the 2021 or 2020 it was, wasn't it? Euros was actually streamed. So it wasn't broadcast; it was actually streamed. That's quite a significant percentage. And look, we've got two concerns on the digital rights. The first is around streaming. So there is an exception that already exists, where if you're not on a regulated EPG but you run a streaming service, and that's a lot of the streaming services at the moment, then you're not covered by the listed events rules. So in principle, you could buy the rights to a listed event and then charge for people to access it. We don't think that loophole's been closed entirely by the media bill. In fact, it hasn't been closed by the media bill, nor will it be closed entirely by the extension of the regulation of EPGs, because quite a few of these streaming services are not on EPGs. So we think that in particular, because that's about live rights, it is a really, really important loophole that does need to be closed in the existing regime, and the government's gone a bit of the way, but not quite as far as it needs to go to close that. The second one, I think, is our other digital rights, and to give you an example of something like clip rights, where you can imagine a situation where someone could auction clip rights, which we currently get as part of our overall live rights for coverage, but you can imagine someone separating them off and saying, here's a separate package of clip rights, and you can show clips almost immediately after the coverage has been broadcast, and you can show every single clip if you want, and you could string that together and it would look a bit like on an online or a social media platform. It wouldn't look like live coverage, but it would be quite close. And the risk of that, it undermines the value from the PSBs and listed events, but secondly, I think it fragments the audience, because potentially what you get are categories of the audience, younger people potentially, choosing to watch on a social media service run by YouTube or by Facebook, rather than watching the PSB. And we offer all of these things currently via our own services, and it would be a pity, I think, to split up that audience to allow those rights to go to other people. And gradually, I think the PSBs would find themselves in a bit of an old world of simply live streaming, rather than bringing the whole audience together with the whole event and being able to create a real national buzz around what we do, which is what we do at the moment.
You are on record, aren't you, as criticising this loophole that would allow unregulated... You don't think this sufficiently deals with it at all?
I don't. No,
okay.
I don't.
How would you amend the bill to?
Well, I think what you need to do is extend the definition of those people who are not PSBs, as it were, because at the moment there's a definition, I think, of it's a broadcasting service and internet program service. The definition of internet program service at the moment requires you to have an on-demand service associated with the streaming service, and I think that's the nub of the problem, because if it just said a streaming service rather than the definition of internet program service didn't require you also to have an on-demand service associated with it, I think that might do it, and that's the difficulty of the definition at the moment under their proposed amendment of section 98. We're happy to write to the committee with the detail of that, because it does get you into the drafting of how you would close that loophole. We thought the government had closed it, but actually looking at the definition of internet program service, if you were a streaming service without an on-demand service, you wouldn't fall into that category, and therefore you wouldn't be covered by the regime, and quite a lot of them wouldn't have an on-demand service associated with them.
Khalid, the Commercial Broadcasters and Online Demand Services Association say it's misguided to and it restricts competition to not have the digital rights within this regime. Do you agree?
Well, look, I echo everything and agree with everything Magnus has said, and I think, I guess in a way, just thinking about the context of the media bill as a whole, and I think consistent with everything that all of us are saying here, is that, look, what we think is that the legislative framework needs to keep up with viewer behaviour. And as Magnus has said, we see over 50% of viewing today is to live content. In about 10 years' time, that will be about a third of all viewing. And if the intent, if the policy intent is that there are certain sporting events that are considered important enough that they should be seen they should be available to all audiences, universally available, free to watch. That's, we can absolutely support that principle. Given the way viewing behaviour is changing, it is only right that principle extends to digital platforms as well as linear platforms.
Okay, and same question, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, we wholeheartedly agree. It's Channel 5. I mean, Channel 5 has, as the smallest broadcaster, PSB rather, has not had any listed events for a while, though we have carried highlights for listed events. So where the main listed event has been on a commercial channel, we've taken highlights, particularly cricket, in recent years. But we absolutely agree that if the direction of travel towards making it a PSB benefit, and we'd also hope including digital rights is the right way forwards.
Do you think this bill as currently drafted would enable digital rights to be added?
I don't see any reason why it couldn't be added.
It sounds like the government's a bit dithering and deciding what to do. They've not quite made their mind up.
I think to be fair to the government, it's not a totally straightforward issue. I mean, I think the streaming issue is relatively easy to deal with because you're talking there about the live coverage, and that's what the list events regime does. I don't think that's difficult to make that change. I think the other digital rights is possibly slightly more tricky, and I think there what my suggestion would be that there is a secondary power for the Secretary of State to define other types of coverage or other types of rights subject to the same regime, and for that to be subject to approval of Parliament via secondary legislation would be my suggestion.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Rupert. John.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm hoping to return to Channel 4 later on in today's questioning, but perhaps I could start with ITV and you, Mr. Brooke. Let's begin on the question of prominence. A lot of people are very concerned with prominence, and for people watching at home and they don't know what that means when you turn on your telly and you're looking at a list of channels, how high up are certain channels? If you do it at the moment, I checked this morning with Virgin, and astonishingly, right up at the top is, or near the top, is Top TV, which has got very small viewing figures and wouldn't be something I'd be particularly recommending anybody to watch, given the daily ranting that you hear there from presenters. What protection do you think there needs to be for companies like STV, for example, in Scotland, or ITV or others, in the bill over prominence?
Look, I think the bill is trying to, I think, do the right thing, which is to ensure that ITV and STV and others can get prominence for their on-demand services, which include streaming versions of our channels. And there's a very difficult balance, I think, that the government's trying to strike between making absolutely clear that these services are going to be prominent, and not just the services themselves, the apps, as it were, but also content within them. And the streaming services themselves, if they're provided within the app.
So how do we end up in a position at the moment where Top TV is right up there at the top, and what could be done about that? Because that's promoting Top TV way above its position in the national discussion, its viewing figures, or any other criteria by which one would judge a broadcaster.
Yeah, look, I mean, Mr. Nicholson, you put your finger on a really important point, which is I suspect there is a commercial relationship somehow or other between that channel and the platform. And that is the nature of the problem that we're going to have to deal with increasingly.
What do you want in this bill to address that?
Well, I think what we've got in the bill is a clear obligation on platforms to make services like STV Player or ITVX prominent on platforms, and content within it to be prominent. What there isn't in the bill is enormous amounts of detail about exactly what prominence means. So it is different for a world, which we have at the moment with the communications bill, where you have the concept of an EPG written into primary legislation. I think that's something that we're all quite keen to avoid, because there isn't such a fixed concept in the world that's hurtling towards us in terms of internet TV. What we need are a set of principles, I think, in the bill, and some detail around things like the fact that algorithms can't override prominence, which is a really important part of the proposals that the government has made. And then what we're going to need is a really muscular interpretation and implementation by Ofcom with very clear marching orders from Parliament. This is what Parliament wants to see in terms of the prominence of PSB content and players. You, Ofcom, must now go and implement that through a muscular set of guidelines which you draw up on the strength of the legislation that Parliament passes. I think that's the right way to do it, because I think the problem otherwise is you'll end up with a piece of legislation that's out of date before it's even gone through Parliament. Because the number of ways in which platforms make content prominent or not in this new world are so varied, from recommendations to voice search to other forms of search to the prominence of apps to all sorts of surfacing in various other contexts. So you're going to have a much more subtle and sophisticated approach, I think.
Okay, now as the chair has explained, we're going to have the boss of ITV before us very soon to talk about the news story that's dominating at the moment, but I think it'd be very odd if we had somebody senior like yourself from ITV without asking a couple of questions about the story about this morning. I suppose I should ask, first of all, are you okay?
Am I okay?
Yes.
Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
Because I know that's the question du jour at this morning. I spent some time at the weekend talking to whistleblowers from ITV, including people who work and have worked in this morning. It seems like a very unhappy place. Are you satisfied with the duty of care that the editorial team and senior managers provide to staff, especially young staff working there and at ITV more generally?
Mr. Nicholson, I mean, I think there's a very sophisticated and a significant system of safeguarding and duty of care at ITV with a very significant set of policies. We have a code of conduct which sets out our expectations about how people behave, and that deals with a number of different issues, from equal opportunities to respect at work, dignity and understanding. And then we then have an important set of requirements which hold people to account internally.
Why are so many of the staff so unhappy, former and current staff?
I can't answer that question at the moment, Mr. Nicholson. As you know, we've also appointed Jane Mulcahy, a KC, to have a look at the circumstances.
Yes, I know. You already had an inquiry, and of course, and we'll come on to this on the 14th in more detail, but several of the claims that ITV made about that previous inquiry don't seem to quite hold water on closer inspection. What do you make about the bullying allegations that we've heard over the last week?
What do I make of them?
Yeah, what do you make of them? As a senior ITV official, what do you feel when you hear staff complain about bullying? Because that's the worst thing you can possibly hear, surely, as a senior manager.
No, look, we take our responsibilities in relation to safeguarding and duty of care very seriously. Bullying is absolutely in breach of our code of conduct. It's very clearly set out. We have a set of policies around bullying and harassment at work. And clearly, bullying is unacceptable. If we find bullying, it's inconsistent with our policy. We'd expect people to report it, and we'd expect it to be dealt with appropriately.
And of course, the person that reported in the first instance would be the editor of the programme. Now, we all saw yesterday that surreal performance by the editor of the programme, who, when he was being asked by a reporter from Sky about bullying on the programme, started talking about aubergines. It was surreal and bizarre. I think most people watching that would have thought, this is the person who's responsible for safeguarding young staff. He's being outrageously dismissive and flippant on camera about an immensely serious issue. I wouldn't like to have been a young staffer going and talking to that editor about bullying, given that that's the way he treats the subject matter on camera in public.
Let me reassure you, Mr. Nicholson, that we take these issues very seriously.
But what about what he said?
I wouldn't endorse what he said. In fact,
you agree it's bizarre.
I wouldn't use that word.
What word would you use?
I'd certainly say it was extremely ill-judged to say what he did. But look, I can reassure you on behalf of ITV that we do take all of these allegations very seriously, precisely because we do have a culture in which people's conduct it matters enormously to
Is
ITV.
his position secure after that?
That's not a question for me, and it's not a question for now. As you know, one of the ways in which we're demonstrating that we're taking this seriously is by appointing a very senior KC who's got very significant experience in dealing with HR issues and particularly sensitive investigations, because there are multiple things we have to take into account here around privacy and so on, as you will appreciate, and it's appropriate that actually the KC establishes the facts, gets to the bottom of what's happened, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Giles.
Thank you. Yes, I too have questions on that issue, but I shall leave them until Carolyn McCall comes before us in a week or so's time. But following on from John Nicholson's comments on prominence, it is said that for a public service broadcaster to benefit from prominence, and I'm going first to you, Magnus, if I may, it must be designated as an, in inverted commas, an internet program service, an IPS. It has to be readily discoverable. It's a bit of a wishy-washy term. What does that mean to you?
When you say ready to discover, do you mean the PSB content within the service?
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Well, I think. Let me give you an example at the moment. So, if you go onto ITVX at the moment and you're looking to find last night's news programme, all you need to do is scroll down the home page of our service in order to find the news content from ITV. So I think is it quick to find it? Is it easy to find it? Do you have to search 10 times and put in different words into the search function, or can you actually browse and find the content relatively easily? But in a sense, I can put your mind at rest from an ITV point of view, because I think about 70% or so of ITVX's content is originated UK content. It's not all first run, but it's originated UK content, which absolutely would meet the remit that we're set by Parliament as a public service broadcaster. So our entire purpose at ITVX is to make our PSB content as prominent as we can, because in truth that's why people come to ITV. They're not coming for content they can find elsewhere. They're coming for very distinctive British content, and therefore I can absolutely assure you that content is going to be the most prominent content on our service. And part of what we're providing is news. And actually the interesting thing on news on ITVX is we've had really quite good audiences for news on ITVX. If you take the first 4 months, we've had on average about 8 million views of streamed and on-demand news on ITVX since we launched. Quite a lot of that is streamed viewing, but some of it's on demand. But we've also had 6 million views or so in the first 4 months for our short-form content on ITVX. Because one of the things we're experimenting with is that are there other news forms that we can build an audience for via ITVX, which aren't necessarily about having to go the day after and watching on demand the news programme from the day before. Are there more imaginative ways we can repackage individual items and put them up and so on? And we're very experimenting with that, which feels much more in keeping with how people consume news online, rather than watching an entire long-form programme a day after.
You seem to be very happy with the way that the bill is dealing with this whole promotional aspect, the readily discoverable aspect of it all. I mean, yes. But is it a level playing field? I go to Paramount on this. I go to Mitchell on this. Is it a level playing field for you, do you think?
Yeah, I think that we obviously have all of us on this table. Channel 5 in particular has its peak schedule is very much UK originated, and it fits in that factual genre. That's our kind of go-to. I think that the two areas, if you want to go and binge watch Susan Calman's Grand Days Out, you're able to do that, and it's easily readily findable on the service. I think one thing that we are perhaps slightly differentiated from those on this table is obviously children's content. So if you want to go and catch up on Peppa Pig, or you want to catch up on Thomas Tank Engine, then clearly My5 is a space that parents and families are able to do that. So we think that the bill is broadly correct in this, in terms of making sure and holding us to account, as it were, that within our VOD services, the PSB content is suitably findable and accessible, and clearly Ofcom will have powers to provide guidance to us to ensure that we are being held to account on this. So we think, broadly speaking, we're happy.
Okay, that's good to hear. Khalid, you're nodding.
Yeah, it's similar points, and I mean, for us at Channel 4, we deliver our remit through all of our services, and we consider we deliver our remit through our content as a whole. And within our Channel 4 streaming app, so it's recently rebranded from All 4, as Magnus describes, we think about the app in order to help, design of the app in order to think about how do viewers navigate through and find the content they need. But we also have what we call at the top the hero carousel, i.e. the titles that we're promoting at the top of the app, at the top of the home screen, which will include the most popular content, which provides a gateway into more challenging public service genres, but also we apply a public service overlay and the remit dimension to how we think about what we're recommending at the top of the app. So we absolutely think about surfacing the right PSB content and challenging content through the app, and then as Magnus described, the wider regulatory regime has the media bill has the principles of ensuring that the app as a whole gets prominence, and the live PSB live streams get prominence, and the PSB content gets prominence in the user interfaces into which we're placing those apps. And again, whilst we think there are areas in which the regime could be strengthened, particularly in relation to the agreement objectives and Ofcom dispute resolution, the principles are sensible ones, which we want Ofcom to apply with enough.
Can you say that again? The areas which could be strengthened.
So the area where we think there's strengthening required is what in relation to the agreement objectives in the event that Ofcom needs to intervene. So what I mean by that is clearly this is about prominence for PSB apps and PSB services, PSB content, but it's also about securing fair value in relation to our relationships with platforms. And the regime will require that we as the PSBs or we as Channel 4 are negotiating with a platform in relation to prominence and access to our content and services. And in the event that we fail to reach an agreement with the platform, then Ofcom has a role to play as a backstop in order to intervene, in order to ensure that prominence is delivered.
In your view, that's a carry-out for Ofcom?
Yes. So Ofcom will have that role. The way the draft bill describes those objectives at present, it frames it in terms of Ofcom needing to take into account the costs associated with public service delivery. And we think that applying cost is too narrow, because actually we think the policy intention, and indeed Ofcom's recommendation, is that prominence should be provided on terms that are consistent with sustainable delivery of public service obligations. So what we think that needs to be considered in those agreement objectives is that it needs to take into account the value of PSB delivery and the value that the PSB content provides to these platforms, so that in the event that Ofcom does have to intervene, it can take that broader value into account, not just the costs associated with delivery.
A very good point. Thank you very much. I'd like to talk about video on demand services. And on this, I think, Magnus, I come to you. On what basis do you decide which content to give prominence to on video on demand?
How do we decide what to give prominence to? Well, look, it's a mixture of things. I think that fairly obviously, where we've got a new drama that we've invested a small fortune in, and we're very proud of, and it's got some top talent, we will want to make that prominent because we want to tell viewers about it, and we want them to watch it. So there are some fairly obvious things like that. I think there are other considerations around the audience. So are we do our numbers show that we're reaching all of the audience? Do we need to target particular segments of the audience more than perhaps we have been? So one of the things we're trying to do with ITVX is reach more what we call light viewers. So people who haven't necessarily come to ITV as much over the past few years, can we get them back into ITV? And so we'll look quite carefully at the sort of content that those viewers like, and then we'll try and make that prominent. But as I say, I mean, we've got a pretty prominent news rail on the service, and news is bringing quite a bit of traffic.
As you said earlier in the session, that of course you are a commercial operation. I mean, there must be commercial considerations to prominence.
Of course, and so the light audience point is absolutely about that, because it's about the reach of our services, and one of the things advertisers are interested in is yes, volume, but also reach. Are we reaching as much of the UK population as we can with our advertising? So that's absolutely part of what we're trying to.
Because the advertisers will go to where the prominence is, and will go to the.
It would drive. I mean, the reason prominence matters is because it does drive a bigger audience.
Of course,
it creates more. It creates more eyeballs for advertisers, effectively.
Absolutely, but is the question I really want to put again? I'm using the term again. Is there a level playing field across the ground here? I mean, because everybody is looking for the same pool of advertisers who want to come to their streaming service, their video on demand, whatever, and they want to make sure there's a level playing field. And the question I'm fundamentally asking does this bill do that? And I'll go to you, Mitchell, on that.
I don't think we have any challenges. To build on Magnus's point slightly, and not to be facetious at all, but if you take, for example, PSB players, the BVOD services, have a huge wealth of content, many thousands of hours, and obviously we want to support the PSB remit meeting content on top, but equally we're a commercially driven organisation, so it won't be uncommon, particularly on My 5, that as you move towards Christmas, you will start to see a rail of Christmas movies, and it will bring people in. But the point being that commercial type content, or the Christmas movies, will bring people into a PSB service, and then when they're there, they'll be able to maybe move on to watch some of the content that was previously shown on Channel 5 as more kind of traditional PSB content. So what we're trying to do is both hit our objectives as a PSB to reflect people's lives back to themselves, but at the same time create a proposition, a customer value proposition that is commercially orientated and helps us to then generate revenue that we can reinvest back into content.
Fantastic, very honest answer. Khalid, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of the level playing field point, I don't think the prominence regime is intending to or seeking to override consumer choice. I mean, ultimately, viewers will watch what they want to watch, but we as the UK have taken the view that public service content matters and public service broadcasting matters, and therefore we all think that public service content should be easy to find so that viewers can discover it and ultimately then make the choices and informed choices that they want to make.
Very clear. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I want to turn to selection services and smart TVs and how people are accessing content. The bill aims to capture selection services, but it doesn't cover mobile phones and tablets and other devices. The BBC said that a quarter of content hours on iPlayer in 22 were accessed on other devices that would fall outside the bill. So I'd like to ask, do you think that needs closing? Is it a loophole that you're concerned about, Magnus?
I mean, yes, to an extent. I think that what you can see in the market is that the accessing through tablets and computers is going down quite rapidly, and actually people are now increasingly watching on TV-like devices. I think there are devices, if you like, dual-use devices, particularly gaming consoles and so on, where I think there is more of a question about whether the bill ought to cover those. But I think we think that the bill currently will cover the majority of ITVX's viewing, and so I think we. Of course, we'd prefer it if it went further, but I don't think we're desperately uncomfortable with where the government's ended up. And I would make a more general point, which is, we're talking a lot here about the sort of defects, if you like, of the bill. I think there's just stepping back for a second. I mean, we think the bill is, broadly speaking, going absolutely in the right direction. I think the definition of selection service is quite flexible, and there is a possibility in future that could be broadened out if viewing behaviour changes. And one of the things we're keenest to make sure, actually, is that things that might be excluded at the beginning could potentially come back in if it turns out that we're wrong and that people do carry on, and indeed viewing through tablets increase, for example, or let's say YouTube. I mean, let's say, imagine YouTube start providing what looks like a television selection service because they start aggregating together lots of television, on-demand television services together. It would be entirely appropriate for YouTube at that point to be covered by the bill, and it seems to me there's nothing in the bill at the moment that would stop that from happening. It may not be the case and legitimate at the beginning, but the important thing is that we have a bill that's capable of extending to those platforms, which I think the bill is. I think the only thing it rules out is the button on the remote control, because I think the government's view was that took them into territory, international trade territory, which could cause difficulty. But that seems to me the hardware exception, as it were, in the bill is the main area which isn't going to change. But actually the rest of it is sufficiently flexible to change over time.
Khalid.
Yeah, look, I agree with all of that, and again, as with ITV, we'd clearly prefer to be prominent on as many platforms and devices as possible. But it does feel right that when you look out there in the consumer landscape, the real battleground, for want of a better term, is in terms of smart TV operating systems. It is Samsung, LG, Google TV. Roku is obviously small in the UK but big in the US, and so on and so forth. So prioritising big screen devices, it does feel reasonable and will capture the core of viewing. But to absolutely agree that, look, the bill is proposing a principles-based regime with flexibility to evolve over time, and we're therefore supportive of that.
Thank you. Mitchell, do you
I don't have anything particularly to add. I mean, we're sympathetic to the idea that government must try and draw a boundary somewhere, and we think that they've broadly done it in the right place, and that the inbuilt flexibility for audience change is welcomed.
in the future? Thank you. A little on legacy services. Is the bill sufficiently clear on whether Ofcom could remove a legacy selection service when something's sort of outdated and not receiving technical updates? Those very old platforms. Do you think there's gaps?
It isn't quite, actually, and this is a slight concern we have, in the sense that, and we know this through bitter first-hand experience of launching ITVX last year, which is if you think of a platform, I don't know, Samsung, you think it's a single platform. And therefore, actually, if you write Samsung on the list, it will be fine because you'll be able to have a must-offer obligation on us and a must-carry obligation on them. But actually, Samsung is not a single platform. It's a set of different platforms over time, all under the same umbrella, but some of them were different operating systems, and some of them, frankly, are not supported by Samsung anymore, as we discovered, and therefore it was literally technically impossible to put ITVX on some of those legacy platforms. They are older platforms. It either was literally impossible technically, or it was economically entirely unfeasible to do it, partly because the software simply couldn't support the sophistication of the service that we were offering. So I do think it's really important, and we put this in our submission to the committee, that there is discretion for Ofcom to say, actually, there are certain variants, if you like, of platforms that we may designate that don't have to be covered by this obligation to offer and carry, because it wouldn't be appropriate. And we tried very hard on the launch of ITVX, and we got nearly to 100%, but didn't quite get to 100% of all of the platforms that ITV Hub had been on, because there were some we simply couldn't work out how we could get it on, and nor could the platform in quite a lot of the cases.
Thank you. Do you think that needs to be a case-by-case basis that Ofcom?
Yeah, I think so, because you would definitely say, look, Samsung smart TVs need to be on the list, and various other manufacturers. What I think is probably impractical is to have a list that's 35 pages long, that literally lists not the 2015 variant and so on. I think it's right that there should be a discretion for Ofcom to say, actually, because of practical difficulty, it shouldn't apply to the following models or whatever in practice.
Thank you, Khalid.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. So absolutely agree with that principle that it's an area that Ofcom needs to look at, and there needs to be flexibility. And I think it's fair to say that operationally we encounter these kind of issues ourselves in areas and platforms where we as the PSBs have a stake. So all of our organisations are shareholders in Everyone TV, formerly known as Digital UK, which operates FreeSat, and we're all part of UView. And actually, we do see that different devices have different technical specifications, and therefore our tech and product teams do end up engaging in bespoke work in order to enable delivery on those devices. So absolutely, as there's increasing competition in the device landscape, increasing proliferation of devices, that does create complexity, which should be taken into account in the way the regulatory regime is applied.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Yeah, I would just add. I mean, I read some of the responses to this inquiry over the weekend, and I think I was struck by the fact that actually, on this point specifically, actually many of the platforms also have some of the same concerns, and it would seem odd that if in a kind of must-offer, must-carry regime, we could potentially be in a situation where both a PSB and a platform both struggling to make the technological requirements in order to have that PSB on the said specific platform, and yet there's not the flexibility in the regime to say, actually, well, this is a 2009 type TV that's only got, we need to have that flexibility, and Ofcom needs to be able to make the judgments, because it does feel like there may be some consensus in the industry.
Thank you. So the other side of it is having an annual release and sort of avoiding regulation from that.
Well, I guess there'll need to be a judgment made by Ofcom in terms of which specific devices have still got the suitable proliferation amongst viewers, and also we as PSBs are able to reach the correct technological hurdles to make our products available to them. And I don't think it will work. I'm no expert on this matter, but my assumption is it will not be in a purely linear environment. You just say, after 10 years, there's no there could be some devices which are much more popular. A year is much more popular than another. So I think there does need to be flexibility. But clearly, it's in the interest of both PSBs and the platforms to make sure there's a regime that addresses the issue of legacy devices.
Thank you. So flexibility under Ofcom, basically.
I think one, sorry if I could just add something which really did strike us in the course of the launch of ITVX was I think consumers haven't quite realised yet that televisions are basically computers. And whereas people think about how long a computer would typically last, and I think people's expectation televisions last for ages. Mine's only 10 years old, and it's sort of 10 years in my life of imagine using your computer that you had 10 years ago. And so I think there is something that all of us need to do to help educate consumers that these are different things now when you have a connected TV.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. Clive.
Thank you. I just want to ask about the must offer, must carry agreement objectives. Do you think the bill as it's drafted meets the overall agreement objectives between a regulated television selection service and a public sector broadcaster? I'll come to you, Magnus.
I'm happy to go first. No, I don't think they do quite at the moment. So I think the basic setup of a must carry, must offer regime, as it were, is the right one. And I think you do have to have a dispute resolution function in case we can't agree. And in a sense, to reassure you, what we're looking to do is have a commercial agreement with the platform. So a partnership, a win-win, where we benefit and they benefit. That's what we're looking to do. And we definitely have those sorts of relationships with Sky and with Virgin now. And that's what we want to replicate. In our relationship with them, we sell our advertising, we have our relationships with our advertisers, we can innovate in how we offer things like Planet V, which is our programmatic advertising platform, and we can use data to help target our advertising on ITVX more effectively within those partnerships. So that's what we're looking to do. What we see coming down the track, I think, are, and this is specific to internet television, are a set of internet television platforms who will apply or try to apply a set of terms globally. And those terms are going to be pretty stringent. They're going to require us to give away at least 30% of our revenue, so revenue, not profit, to them simply by being on the platform. They'll require us effectively to go into their advertising system, so we won't necessarily have a relationship with advertisers. We won't be able to innovate in terms of our ad tech. We won't necessarily have access to any data. That's the threat that's coming, and I wouldn't want to understate this. I mean, that is an existential threat to PSB. I mean, there is no other way of putting it. I mean, a third of our revenue is equivalent to more or less approaching what we spend in its entirety out of London in a single year. So that's the threat that's coming. So we need to make sure that the dispute resolution regime enables Ofcom to have enough strength and enough discretion to avoid that outcome and to get us into a place of a win-win in the way that we have with a Virgin or a Sky. That's what we would like. And at the moment, the second agreement objective, which talks only about cost, we think is not the right approach, because effectively what it says is all the PSB can expect from that relationship is to get its costs back. And therefore, from our point of view, we're a commercial business. If we have a hit, we don't just want to get our costs back, we want to make a bit more money so we can reinvest in original content. Similarly, if we want to innovate as we are doing in advertising and in data, in programmatic advertising, or in our relationships that we built over many years with our advertisers, we want to be able to have that relationship, not the platform. And the danger with the formulation at the moment is it's winner takes all for the platform beyond cost. And as a business, we can't simply get our costs back. We have to make a profit. We want to innovate. We want to build on the relationship with our advertisers. So we think that agreement objective needs to be recast. It's really, really important. I can't emphasise it enough how important it is for that agreement objective to be recast. And we put some proposed drafting to the committee, which I can describe. But broadly speaking, what we're suggesting is that Ofcom has discretion to ensure or to look at other arrangements that we have with other players, so with a Virgin or a Sky, let's say, in order to make sure, and I use Sky's words here actually, that this agreement objective ought to protect the PSBs from unreasonable demands from the platforms. I've never heard Sky talk about protecting PSBs from unreasonable demands. But that even there, you use that language. So first bit of it, I think, is that Ofcom needs to be able to look at other arrangements to say, okay, is what this platform is saying, is that consistent with other arrangements that we as a PSB have in place? I think the second is that we ought to have the potential to be able to make the most of our investment in our content in terms of getting the value from hits, in terms of innovation, in terms of use of data. So we ought to be able to fulfill the potential of our business. And I think it may be that cost is a backstop. In other words, no lower than cost as a sort of as a kind of basic backstop, but it has to go further than that, give us more potential to achieve success with our business and on our own merits. And I think the third one is that Ofcom ought to be able to have a look at whether an agreement materially weakens the business of ITVX. Because if in the end the agreement is one-sided and ITVX can't innovate in advertising, it can't innovate in data, it's forced to go into someone else's system, that's not an agreement that is going to result in a sustainable PSB system going forwards. And I think it was DCMS who said that the purpose of this is to improve PSB sustainability. It's not going to do that if we simply have cost as the criteria, because every platform will simply go and say, what's your cost? What's your cost of the programmes? Right, okay, let's allocate that across all the platforms. We'll give you that cost, and you can frankly take every single other term that we want to impose on you. That can't be right, because we're obliged to provide the service.
You mentioned Sky, and there seems to be concerns from both sides of this argument about this particular area of the bill. Is there any consensus coming from the industry itself between the?
Well, I think there's a broad consensus amongst the PSBs. What I haven't done is ask Sky about the proposed amendments we've made. But I have to say, we've drafted those in a way which as far as I'm concerned, meets Sky's test of protecting PSBs from unreasonable demands from the platforms, and people like they and Virgin who have a constructive partnership approach, not a cookie cut of these are the terms, but a genuine look, how can we both win from this relationship? I don't think they have anything to worry about from these arrangements. I mean, you'll have to ask them, but it's very deliberately been drafted with what we see coming down the track, I have to say mainly from the US, of this one size fits all, these are the terms. That's what we're particularly concerned about. And that's why we've constructed the proposed amendments in the way that we have. It's not about Sky and Virgin. We'd be really happy to have conversations with them about how we can make sure that it does one thing and not the other. Because we want to get to a commercial deal, and to be really clear, a commercial deal, a partnership deal. We don't want Ofcom to intervene. We'd rather have a commercial negotiation, because these are complicated relationships. There are lots of facets to them, whether that's data or technology and all the rest of it, and they're much better negotiated than imposed by a regulator. But what we're worried about, just in case I haven't said it already, is this one-size-fits-all approach that we can see, very graphic, and it's nearly here. I mean, we had a devil of a job with ITVX negotiating some of those demands.
Either of you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, agreed. And this links very closely to my response to Mr. Watling's earlier question. I think it was Ofcom who recommended that PSB should be made available on terms that are consistent with sustainable delivery of public service obligations. As Magnus says, a cost recovery based approach is not consistent with that objective. We need to take into account PSB value in the round.
Yeah, I mean, I think we currently have positive deals with those such as Sky and Virgin. What essentially want is what we have now, but on these new platforms with a bit more prominence. It's not hugely complicated, I don't think, in the way that we think about these things. But the reality is we're not able to do that at the moment, and this legislation should hopefully help us do that. I do think that, as Magnus has alluded to, and Khaled as well, that the language could be tightened and nuanced in the legislation, but the overall principle that is set out, we think is broadly correct.
Thank you very much. Damien.
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask a couple of questions about Channel 4, if I may specifically. And starting with Clause 24, which sets out the duty of long-term sustainability, and which puzzles me a bit if I step back from the whole debate over the past couple of years about privatisation, in that the 1990 Broadcasting Act says the duty of the board is to keep Channel 4 sustainable, one of the duties, and indeed generally Companies Act legislation, the 2006 Companies Act, says that any board has a duty to make their firm successful. So what is added by this new sustainability duty?
Yeah, so I think it's correct to say that the members of the Channel 4 Corporation, the board directors, absolutely do comply with directors' duties, as if they were directors of companies by way of the Companies Act 2006, and we do that through their contracts of engagement and via the fact that C4C as a corporation is run to conform with the UK Corporate Governance Code. But in the discussions with DCMS and government around the package that was announced in January, the government had a priority to set out explicitly in legislation a duty on the directors to promote ensure financial sustainability of Channel 4. We're comfortable with that principle and the principle of adding in a clause on that basis. What we have been doing is having some discussion with DCMS around the precise wording of that clause in order to ensure that it doesn't have unintended consequences.
I mean, I'm still puzzled as to, does it add anything? Are your directors going to behave in any different way because of this clause and the way they're already behaving?
So the directors are required to fulfil the primary functions of Channel 4, which includes delivery of the core Channel 4 main channel, and therefore our proposal or preference would be that if there is a sustainability clause in the media bill per section 24, we would want that to refer more directly to the primary functions of Channel 4, and to make sure they align with the Companies Act 2006, particularly section 172.
So you would prefer it if it didn't change much of your existing remit?
Well, the intention, as we understand it, is in order to codify the requirement on the members of the corporation to support and ensure the financial sustainability of Channel 4. We're comfortable with that where it's consistent with delivery of the primary functions of the corporation.
Part of it is to sustain the activities long term. So you must have thought this through. How long is long term?
In terms of how we think about the longer term and how we think about the business, we've got a strategy to transform Channel 4 into a digital first public service media organisation. Our Future 4 strategy, which is about prioritising digital growth and about diversifying revenue streams. We've set ourselves specific targets on that strategy for 2025 to double the size of our streaming service in audience terms, to grow digital advertising to 30% of our total revenues by 2025, to grow non-advertising revenues to be 10% of total revenues by 2025. And we're making good progress against those targets. As we look beyond 2025, we haven't set formal targets for the rest of the decade, but as far as we're concerned, the principles of that strategy remain. As we look to Channel 4 over the rest of this decade, into the next decade, over the next Ofcom licence period, we do need to think about the fact that by the time you get to the end of the next licence period, Channel 4 will continue to be delivering live linear content, but will be increasingly a streaming-based organisation, a streaming-based proposition, and delivering public service content on streaming and social platforms. So the business needs flexibility in order to enable and support that evolution, and the sustainability duty needs to be consistent with that. And so one area where we have expressed some concern is around the language in the drafting around level of activities. So activities is not clearly defined. Level of activities would appear to or could run the risk of limiting the ways in which we can evolve what we're doing in terms of how we're delivering the remit in the interest of viewers. And again, I come back to this, which is why linking to primary functions we think would work better, because primary functions of C4C is more clearly defined in existing legislation.
And then obviously there is, as it were, precedent there. So you would prefer the bill basically not to tie you down too much. Is that?
Or there is there is well-rehearsed and clear definitions of Channel 4's primary functions and duties, and therefore ensuring commercial sustainability and delivery of those duties and those functions would appear to be a reasonable way forward.
And one of the, obviously the biggest specific change is the abolition of the publisher-broadcaster split. Do you think that's particularly helpful for your long-term sustainability, for you to become more of a publisher-broadcaster?
I mean, so we, the independent production sector is the lifeblood of Channel 4. We have spent the last 40 years working very closely with our partners in the independent production sector. They are our lifeblood. We don't make our own content, and we never have made our content for Channel 4. And as this committee will be aware, a change to the publisher broadcaster status is not something that we called for during the DCMS consultation into the future ownership of Channel 4. But it's a decision that the government made in order to give Channel 4 the flexibility and optionality to make its own programs in the future if that's what we want to do, and we accept that proposal. But what we do say is that in the event that the publisher broadcast restriction is removed, of course that requires the media bill to pass. In the event that the publisher broadcast restriction is removed, we don't have any in-house production at present. It would take time to build up, and we would do it in a way that is, it would have to be both the business case and the public policy aspects and the commissioning aspects and the wider stakeholder relationship aspects would have to be carefully considered.
Have you decided yet that you, assuming the bill passes in roughly its current form, that you will definitely go down that route, you'll make your own content?
So, well, I'll be very transparent with you. What we're doing is we're looking at the strategic options available to Channel 4 in the event that the restriction is removed. And and as we look across the market, we see there's a whole host of ways in which organisations have built up in-house production or intellectual property-based activities. You can build up from scratch, and therefore have a greenfield organic growth, as it were, and that is an option. But obviously that requires a lot of investment. Production margins can be quite tight. An organisation like Channel 4 doesn't currently have the capabilities in house in order to do that quickly. So that would be gradual and take time. As ITV for instance grew its already large production business, ITV did a lot of growth through acquisition of production companies. Now again, that's an option of potentially available, but we have a debt limit. We don't have those level of resources in order to go big on something like that. So there are other ways you can look at partnerships and joint ventures, for example, to help drive intellectual property growth. So we don't have a set way forward. We're exploring the options and discussing those with our board. But we're also interested in understanding where government is going to come out in the process that DCMS is engaging with the wider production sector, in order to help understand the impact of on the production sector of this change, because we share the government's objective that whilst there's benefit to Channel 4 in greater commercial flexibility from this change, it needs to be managed in a way that is consistent with a continued flourishing independent production sector.
And with that in view, as a final probe, are you at the stage yet of thinking what kind of quota of your own content you would want to make? Is it sort of 20% or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a fixed view because again we're thinking through these strategic options as to kind of what in-house production might look like in the event that we did it. I mean, the government is thinking about, is there a need for additional protections and mitigations for the production sector in the event of this change, and should that involve any changes to quotas and so on and so forth? And we think ultimately that's a matter for government in order to reach its view based on its consideration of the pros and cons. But I mean, our general starting point here is that if the government is wishing to give optionality and potential commercial flexibility to Channel 4, then a proportionate way forward would be to give that flexibility, but allow Ofcom as the sector regulator to consider what protections and mitigation might be needed in order to enable those to evolve over time as needed, rather than set any additional mitigations in legislation, for instance, in order to put them fixed at this point in time and therefore make them harder to evolve. And then the more broader point, which again we have made to DCMS, is that if DCMS, if the government wants Channel 4 potentially to generate value from having flexibility, from having the commercial freedom and flexibility in this area, the more onerous the additional restrictions that are placed on Channel 4 in the event of this change, the harder it is to develop a commercially sustainable business case.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just ignore that. That's just the parliamentary day starting. Can I just press you on that a little bit? We're clearly coloured in a different place that we thought we'd be in this piece of legislation regarding Channel 4. But there's no doubt that you're still facing some considerable challenges. You know, you've got, well, I mean, as you say, a kind of business model based upon paying others to make your product and then effectively letting them keep the profits. You've got huge overheads at a time when advertising revenues are being sucked up by many of your streaming competitors. Huge wage bills of a CEO reportedly on £1.4 million a year, the highest in the network's history, and cancelling shows at the 11th hour reportedly as well. What's the plan? I mean, is Channel 4 genuinely sustainable for the future in the long term?
Yeah, my starting point would be to say that Channel 4 is in very strong creative health. You know, you'll have seen we recently won 9 BAFTA awards, the most we've won in 22 years. For programming like I Am Ruth, Derry Girls, our Ukraine news coverage. You know, in film, we've had 40 nominations at the Big Film Awards. We've won 8 awards. So we're in very strong creative health. The pressures that you describe in relation to some of the commissioning decisions that we've recently made, for instance, you know, they are short-term market pressures. You know, all of us as commercial broadcasters or commercially funded broadcasters are experiencing pressures in the ad market relating to the economic conditions that we find ourselves in as the UK. And our priority throughout this period is to preserve shows as much as we can, is to minimise any disruption or cancellations to commissioning. And any decisions that we make are about ensuring the sustainability and delivering the sustainability of Channel 4's remit delivery. And actually in 2022 was a record year for content investment for Channel 4. We invested more in 2022 than we did in any other year. And we're actually going to invest a similar amount in content this year. But what we are doing is phasing our activity a bit more given the market conditions that we find ourselves in. So actually I would say that the activities that we're having to take in the short term, whilst we absolutely acknowledge are painful for some of our suppliers and we're very grateful to them for working with us through this period, they are activities that reflect short-term market conditions. They don't reflect in any way any concerns about long-term sustainability. And what we will be doing shortly is briefing Indies on our 2024 and 2025 commissioning needs. We'll be briefing Indies on that later this year in order to give forward visibility of our commissioning plans going forward.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Yes, could I come in perhaps with you, Mr. Hatch? This is the second time since I joined Parliament in 2015, we've fought off privatisation of Channel 4. I hope this is the last time that you have to do it. But it's quite odd, isn't it, the fallout from it? You don't really want these changes, do you?
Well, look, Channel 4 is a publicly owned asset. It's entirely reasonable for the government from time to time to look at whether the current ownership model is the right model and whether.
You think it's the right model, don't you?
Well, through the consultation process, we saw our role as providing evidence and analysis to set out the implications for remit delivery.
You didn't say what we really want is for you as a government to allow us to make our own programmes. You didn't say that at any point.
Well, we set out the implications or the impacts on remit delivery of potential changes to the model.
So what's happened, am I right, is the government, in order to justify this whole long process of looking at Channel 4 and looking at privatising Channel 4, it can't simply retreat and say, well, that was a complete waste of time, we're walking away from it, Channel 4 is one. They've got to have a fig leaf to show they've achieved something. And the fig leaf appears to be that you're now going to be forced to make your own programmes, except you're not going to do it, are you?
So, I mean, look, you'll have to ask the government about their.
Well, but I'm asking you at this precise moment.
Thank you. But my understanding is that in autumn 2022, the Secretary of State made a decision to re-examine the business case for Channel 4 privatisation. We inputted into that process. The business case was re-examined. The Secretary of State looked at the evidence and took the view that privatisation of Channel 4 is not needed in order to sustain the remit delivery.
It did last time. It was a long, expensive process. Are you going to start making programmes?
Well, as I said, we are looking at the strategic options. We do see how, over the medium term, Channel 4 owning more intellectual property and making its programmes could deliver value for Channel 4. We're looking at the strategic options, working with our board on those options, whilst we're trying to also, in parallel, try to see where government comes out in relation to...
I've talked to lots of senior people at Channel 4. I'll be astonished if 5 years from now you're going to be making your own programmes. I understand why you say, yes, we'll look at it. But in reality, you're being given a power that you're never going to use. It just seems a monumental waste of time as part of this bill. To give you something that you've not asked for and that you don't want and that you'll never use. Isn't that the ultimate in pointlessness when it comes to legislation?
The government is providing the commercial flexibility, the optionality for Channel 4. It will be a matter for Channel 4, the corporation and its board, to decide whether and how to use that optionality.
We'll wait with bated breath. Thank you.
Wait with bated breath for Kevin.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this place of warmth and magic, to coin a phrase. I just want to follow up as well on Channel 4 a little bit on that. I mean, isn't John Nicholson right in a way that basically privatisation of Channel 4, the proposal in the first place, was a solution in search of a problem? And the current proposals within the draft media bill about Channel 4 are exactly the same thing. A solution in search of a problem in order that the government can save a bit of face over the second debacle in less than a few years around Channel 4 privatisation. That's a fair assessment, isn't it?
The government chose to re-examine the business case for Channel 4 privatisation and made a decision.
I know that, and you've said that already, but I mean, I'm asking you whether you would agree with me that basically all of this is a solution in search of a problem. Because actually, as a Channel 4 executive, I expect you to say, as your very highly paid chief executive has actually said to us quite frankly on occasions, that you don't agree with these proposals and that you effectively that's what they are, a solution in search of a problem that doesn't really exist.
The package announced by the government in January is intended to ensure the long-term commercial sustainability of Channel 4 as a not-for-profit, publicly owned public sector.
Yeah, I know, and you've said all that already, but I mean, is there really a problem here? That's what I'm saying, that this is a solution to.
Well,
in your opinion, as a Channel 4 executive speaking for the company, is there a problem with the current structure and boundaries that apply to Channel 4 that this is a solution to?
Through the consultation process, we made clear our view that we don't see a commercial...
So the answer then is that you don't think it is a solution to it?
The government has decided on this sustainability package, and we've welcomed the government's announcement.
I know that, and you've said that already, but I mean, all I'm asking you is, I thought Channel 4's position on this was quite clear until you started speaking about it, and that is that they thought this was not something they really particularly welcomed, and they didn't want because it didn't solve any problem that existed. But are you saying that there is a problem that exists? The government obviously think there's a problem, I accept that, but I didn't think Channel 4 thought there was a problem.
Well, having commercial flexibility to evolve one's business in the future doesn't mean there's a problem with the business. It just means there are levers available. There will be levers available to Channel 4, and Channel 4 will decide how to use them.
On the sustainability clause, when you were answering questions from Damien Green earlier on, he asked you a question which I don't think you really answered, which was basically the question, what difference will the sustainability clause make to the way that your directors behave in practice?
So the sustainability clause...
And is the answer to that none?
The sustainability clause will create an obligation on the directors in the Media Bill, Media Act, in
I'm aware of
order to
that.
long-term sustainability.
But what difference will it make to the way your directors behave in practice, which is what Damien Green asked you earlier on? Is the answer to that none?
So the sustainability clause needs to be implemented in a way that is consistent with delivery of the primary functions of Channel 4.
Sorry, that doesn't answer my question. Do you expect that your directors to behave in any different way than they currently do as a result of the introduction of the sustainability clause? Do you expect that there's two options to answer that? Yes, they will behave differently, or no, they won't behave differently because they're actually behaving in that way already.
The directors focus on the primary functions of Channel 4, and it's important for that focus to remain.
I understand that answer, to be honest with you, but I think it means that no, it won't make any difference because they already do behave in that way in any case. But correct me if I'm wrong, if that's my interpretation of what you're saying. Can I just ask about, you mentioned earlier on about commissioning activity in Channel 4 and the difficulty of doing that when times are tough. Now, during the privatisation process, Channel 4 introduced a new current affairs programme, The Andrew Neil Show. Andrew Neil is a brilliant political interviewer, without doubt. I may not agree with his politics, but there's undoubtedly that he is a top political interviewer, and he was given a show. And some people suggested that he was given that show in order to try to call off the dogs a bit on the right of the Conservative Party and from the government around privatisation, to show, if you like, that Channel 4 wasn't just about Channel 4 News, which is a particular bête noire of some people within the government and on the right of the Conservative Party. So I think that show's had 3 seasons. Is that going to be recommissioned now that privatisation is off the cards?
I don't make commissioning decisions for Channel 4. So
Do you have any information you could share with us?
What I'd say is that we are committed to delivery of impartial news and current affairs. That's a licence obligation. It's at the heart of what we do. We're absolutely focused on that. And all of our news coverage has always been found to be impartial. We've never been found to be in breach of those licence requirements. And we see the role of Channel 4 News and Current Affairs and public service broadcasting in the round to provide a range of perspectives, to provide a range of viewpoints, and to provide challenge.
It might be recommissioned. You just don't know is the answer to that question.
Well, I mean,
it's not going to be just dropped because privatisation is off the cards.
I don't make commissioning decisions for Channel 4.
Okay. Can I just ask about, perhaps I'll turn to Mitchell, about the new code that is being proposed for the new video on-demand code that's being proposed within the Media Bill. What's your view of that, and what changes do you think that might be needed in relation to that? And if possible, can you reference any implications it might have for coverage during election periods?
So I should begin by saying that Paramount's a slightly unique position within the UK market. Obviously, it is the owner of a public service broadcaster in Channel 5, but also global streaming platform Paramount Plus, for whom we would anticipate that the Tier 1 standards code would apply. I think at a general level, we are very sympathetic to the notion that as a viewer moves between devices, that clearly different regulatory regimes exist or do not exist for some services, and that it's important that standards are upheld across between services. Because when a viewer is watching on a PSB linear channel and then maybe go and watch on a SVOD service, or then go and watch on a simulcast on another service, that the audience needs to expect that they're getting a similar delivery in terms of broadcasting standards. We broadly welcome the regime. We think it makes sense and it's logical. And I say that from both from a PSB perspective as Channel 5 and also from the Paramount Plus side of the business. I think the one area that clearly is interesting that's come up previously is this area around the direct transposition, maybe of some aspects of the broadcasting code into the VOD environment. Clearly, there are differences in the way that we view linear content. You can turn on a TV channel and you'll just land on something when it comes to linear viewing, whereas on a VOD service, you're pulling content. Broadly speaking, on the area of impartiality and transposing those rules and the rules around elections, for example, we we would say that we recognise there are some concerns in the market and in the industry, but we would say that we are already regulated by Ofcom, and by the way, that, you know, Paramount Plus is notified to Ofcom under the current rules. And we would anticipate that Ofcom would, as a kind of well-versed regulator, will address those differences and find a way to ensure that audiences are sufficiently protected, that impartiality is suitably delivered, that during election periods the right processes are taken place without instigating significant business disruption. And it's important that the regulator gets the balance correct. But we have a high degree of confidence that Ofcom will be able to deliver that.
Okay. Finally, can I just come to you, Magnus? Earlier on, John Nicholson also asked about a matter I've raised before with Ofcom at this committee about Talk TV and its prominence on the electronic programming guide, which comes about as a result of it purchasing time on the local TV slot in many parts of the country. Would this draft bill, or bill as drafted, do anything to prevent that sort of activity taking place in future, i.e. broadcasters and so-called news channels that have no actual public service broadcasting remit being able to purchase places high up on the electronic programming guide by acting as a sort of succubus on local TV channels?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, I think, you know, in a sense, the whole question of prominence.
I think it ought to, because
Well,
you're there on Channel 3 with your news as a public service broadcaster. There they are on wherever it is, 8 or, you know.
In a sense, I think the future of local TV is a question for government rather than a question for ITV.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Kevin. Julie.
Thank you, Chair. Mitchell, going back to the video on demand code, should existing catalogues have to be compliant with the new code?
Well, certainly from my 5 perspective, the vast majority of content has already been on broadcast, so that we would anticipate that it would already meet the standards of any new code. Clearly, services have many thousands of hours of content, and so what we would seek that there is either some kind of suitable implementation period to allow catalogues to be to give companies time to ensure that catalogues
How long do you think it would take for your catalogues to be checked, to be compliant?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, and I can't answer that right now. But what I would say is that Ofcom should consult with industry and find a suitable reasonable. I think it's completely reasonable.
Could anybody in your organisation answer that, or is it just that your company doesn't know the answer?
Well, I would anticipate, so for us specifically, so most of the content has already been broadcast on linear TV, and for Paramount Plus we're already notified in the UK to Ofcom under its ODPS codes. So I would imagine for us as a business it would be a reasonably short period of time. However, at the same time, I recognise that we are not, you know, there are some services that are planned that are currently not regulated in the UK, which this bill intends to bring into scope, and clearly that must be a consideration for Ofcom as well.
And in what way could the requirements for signed programming on Paramount Plus be problematic?
We think that there needs to be consultation with those who use British Sign Language in order to assess what their expectations are. So to give you an example, I'm just going to talk you through our business, as it were. Channel 5, we have 5% signing. That is our obligation. That's what we deliver. We also have a series of pay TV channels, which you know the brands, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, MTV. And for those, we hit the threshold of being required signing. But it's deemed that because the expense is so great to put signing on those channels, and it would be a very limited amount of signing on, you know, channels which have relatively low viewing compared to the PSBs. There was a scheme set up, I'm going to get my dates wrong, but just around a decade ago with Ofcom, in order to, instead of putting signing on those channels, we give a very significant amount of money to the British Sign Language Broadcasting Trust, which makes programming in British Sign Language. So it makes programs. That scheme, we feel, works very well, and we feel that there should be some kind of consultation.
Do you think that would be a model to be extended to make this work?
If that's what the British Sign Language community wants. We pose it as a question in our response rather than saying this is what is required, but clearly that scheme works very effectively, and there may need to be some flexibility with that scheme, but clearly there needs to be some consultation, and it should be those users of British Sign Language also being consulted as part of this to explain what they would like to see as outcomes from this bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Well, that concludes our session for today. Can I thank all the witnesses for their time today, and particularly for your forbearance at the beginning of this session where we had a few technical issues. A number of you have mentioned additional bits of written evidence, which we'd be very grateful to receive. And in the meantime, thank you very much for your time today. Order.
Thank you.